The argument at the heart of this book is that the New World made the modern world and now threatens to undo it. So much of What is America seeks to understand the rise of the United States from small colony to world power, but I raise this question within a larger context that has been neglected. Modern America and modern civilization in general are the culmination of a half-millennium we might call the Columbian Age. For Europe, and later its offshoots, the Americas, North, Central, and South, really were El Dorado, a source of unprecedented wealth and growth. Our political and economic culture, especially its North American variant, has therefore been built on a gold rush mentality of more tomorrow. The American dream of new frontiers and endless plenty has seduced the world. Yet this seduction has triumphed, just as the Columbian Age shows many signs of ending, having exhausted the earth and aroused appetites it can no longer feed. In short, the future isn't what it used to be. When Stanley Kubrick made the film 2001: A Space Odyssey 40 years ago, it did not seem far-fetched to imagine that by the start of this millennium, Americans might have a base on the moon and be flying manned craft to Jupiter. After all, only 5 decades had passed from the first aeroplane to the first space flight. But by the real 2001, there had been no man on the moon since 1972. Elderly space shuttles were falling out of the sky. And the defining event of that year, and perhaps of this new century, was not a voyage to outer planets, but the flying of airliners into skyscrapers by fanatics. In What is America, each chapter has little quotations or epigraphs at the top. And at the first chapter, there are 2 that I think encapsulate what I see as the dichotomy between America, speaking of America in this sense as the United States, America's ideals and the realities, the difference between myth and history. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, writing in 1784 on the subject of slavery, he himself, of course, was a slave owner, said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just." 204 years later, after an American warship shot down an Iranian airliner, killing all 290 people on board, George H. Bush, father of the present president, said, "I never apologize for the United States of America. I don't care what the facts are." And 4 months later, I mean, it's an extraordinary statement. I think that would have sunk most politicians in most countries. 4 months later, he was elected president. The United States is now the world's lone superpower, a successor to Britain, to Spain, and even ancient Rome, an empire whose deeds could make or break this century. So both within and beyond America, people are asking themselves what sort of imperium this might be. Will the new Rome, like the old, see its democracy wither as its power grows? Will it be ruled by a Senate, a Caesar, or a Nero? Will its dominion be benign and inclusive, offering benefits as well as duties to its subjects, as in Rome and Britain at their best? Or will it be a rapacious overlordship, a robber empire extorting tribute and obedience, like the unloved reign of the Aztecs, or the client state networks of both Cold War superpowers at their worst? After the flawed presidential election of 2000, the new Bush regime took the United States further to the political right than any other major Western country since 1945, a shift that began before the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. Washington's reaction to that tragedy, trampling its own constitution and the Geneva Conventions in an unjust war on terror, so-called, has squandered solidarity at home and goodwill abroad, provoking a re-examination of the nation's essence. Is America what it thinks it is? Is America what the world has long believed it to be? Well, I hold that the recent difficulties run much deeper than a stolen election and an overreaction to a terrorist assault. The political culture and identity crisis of the United States are best understood as products of the country's past, the real past, not the imaginary one of national myth. The United States did not grow in a vacuum by the power of its ideals. It is not so much a new Europe transplanted across the Atlantic as a unique organism engendered by history's Big Bang, the collision of worlds that began in 1492. So the America of my title has two meanings: the great republic most of the world simply calls America, and the American landmass as a whole. My question, what is America, applies to both. The year 1492 wasn't very long ago. If you're past 50, as I am, you've seen for yourself at least a tenth of the time since Columbus sailed. We're all still living with the consequences, good and bad. Our world descends from the American surprise that stopped Columbus on his way to Asia. Within a few decades of that momentous contact, the wealth, crops, and land of half a planet, a half that had been developing in isolation for at least 15,000 years, were suddenly laid open to the whole. The seed that would become the United States was planted then. The new order is indeed a new world order, and modern America more truly American than we know. As the historian Frederick Jackson Turner first recognized in 1893, this was a paper he gave at the Chicago World Fair in that year, also called the Columbian Exhibition. The United States, quote, was forged in the crucible of the frontier, end quote. Well, in the mythology created by romantic novels and Hollywood westerns, the frontier is a virgin wilderness tamed by heroic pioneers. The real frontier was a rolling three-century war zone from 1607 to 1890, in which the continent violently changed hands. As white migrants both displaced and absorbed the original Americans, a new culture came into being, a rapacious hybrid dependent on expansion, part European, part indigenous, yet neither. Elements of the old European civilization withered or got left behind. Other elements grew rank in new ways. Isolated and unschooled, the frontier became a breeding ground for militarism and religious extremism, the two aspects of American culture that outsiders and many Americans find most alarming today, especially when they converge in government policy, as they did under Ronald Reagan, and again, more strongly, under George W. Bush. Even before the Indian Wars ended in 1890 at Wounded Knee, the United States had begun projecting its power across the Pacific and into Latin America. The nation did not wake up one morning and find that it was suddenly imperial. It always has been so. Indeed, its founding president, George Washington, called the United States a rising empire back in 1783. And nearly 2 centuries later, President John F. Kennedy proclaimed, "Our frontiers today are on every continent, stretching 10,000 miles across the Pacific, and 3,000 and 4,000 miles across the Atlantic, and thousands of miles to the south," end quote. When American Marines sing from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, they are not boasting idly, but recalling their conquest of Mexico in 1847 and a war with Libya as early as 1801. The new republic was also a bold and worthy experiment an attempt to remake Western civilization along utopian ideals of freedom, democracy, and opportunity. The world's best hope, as Thomas Jefferson, its third president, famously said. But the practice of those ideals relied on a unique historical circumstance, the opening up of a new territory with new means in which to try them. Seen from within by free citizens, the young United States was indeed a thriving democracy in a land of plenty. Seen from below by slaves, it was a cruel tyranny. And seen from beyond by free Indians, it was a ruthlessly expanding empire. All these stories are true, but if we know only one without the others, what we know is not history, but myth, and such myths are dangerous. In chapter 2 of the book, I go into, in more detail, the ways in which the New World transformed the Old, and particularly not only the gold and silver from Mexico and Peru, which Adam Smith and Karl Marx both recognized was the startup capital for what became the Industrial Revolution, but even more importantly, the food crops, which drastically transformed the world's food supply and led to the population boom that we have today. And meanwhile, the population in the Americas was collapsing from diseases from the old. And so there was a kind of colossal economic and demographic pump working across the Atlantic. But I'll just move on to the early settlement by English colonists, which began about 100 years after the Spanish conquests of Mexico and Peru. The history of white America runs down through time in two gathering streams that eventually collide in the Civil War of the 1860s. The slave-owning South flows from the Virginia plantations, while the entrepreneurial North rises from Plymouth and other colonies founded in New England a few years later by Puritans and profiteers. The latter categories were not mutually exclusive. One of New England's first leaders wrote, "Religion and profit jump together." In December 1620, the Pilgrim Fathers alighted from the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock. Every American schoolchild learns this nation-founding fact. What they seldom learn is that the Pilgrims were soon accosted there in fluent English by a lonely, grief-stricken Wampanoag. On the face of it, this man, whose name was Squanto, had little reason to be friendly. About 1615, he had been kidnapped in a slave raid on the Massachusetts coast, probably by an associate of John Smith, the man who, of course, was one of the leaders of the other colony at Jamestown, the slightly earlier colony, and whose life is said to have been spared by Pocahontas. The Wampanoags were one of many Native American peoples on the eastern coast, up in the northern area there. He'd been kidnapped in a slave raid on the Massachusetts coast, probably by an associate of John Smith, taken to Spain, and sold in a Malaga slave market. Somehow he escaped, made his way to England, and returned via Newfoundland to Massachusetts, an amazing journey that took him 4 years. When Squanto got back home, he found his town, Patuxet, inhabited only by the dead. A plague or a mix of plagues, likely including smallpox, had struck the New England coast, killing 9 out of 10 in many places, and everyone at Patuxet. Smallpox was terrible enough for Europeans, but because Native Americans had no immunity, they caught it far more easily and suffered more severely. Well, word of Squanto's town, with empty houses, worked fields, and cribs full of corn for the winter, had reached the Pilgrims during a landfall at Cape Cod. They sailed on to Patuxet, renamed it Plymouth, and moved in. Their leader wrote, "The good hand of God favored our beginnings by sweeping away great multitudes of the natives, that he might make room for us." Well, despite the Almighty's favor, about half the would-be settlers died that winter of hunger and scurvy. The Plymouth colonists were mostly fighters, traders, and townsfolk, unskilled on the land. Late December was a bad time to turn up in North America anyway, especially after a long crossing. Once they'd eaten everything in the ghost town of Patuxet, Plymouth, the Pilgrims began raiding the country for miles around. The decimated Wampanoags were not a rich source of supply, even at gunpoint. Meanwhile, their western neighbors and traditional foe, the Narragansetts, had avoided the worst of the plague and were threatening the Patuxet region. Probably for this reason, Squanto and other survivors decided to help the newcomers. In the spring, they made peace with the English, teaching them how to grow maize and other American crops, and later how to repay the earth with the autumn festival of Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims thanked their God for saving them in a wilderness, but the feast speaks for itself. Turkey, corn, beans, pumpkin, cranberries, potatoes, and the rest came from thousands of years of New World civilization. It was the heathen, not the Lord, who saved them. The Patuxet Pilgrims repaid their native hosts in two ways. In 1622, Squanto and other Wampanoags died in yet another wave of European disease. That was accidental. The second way was clearly intentional. About 1630, William Bradford, a leader of Plymouth, began writing a polemical history of his flock. Although only a decade had passed since the Pilgrims' arrival, and the help given by the Wampanoags must still have been fresh in their minds, Bradford didn't care about the facts. What mattered was the myth. Here's what he wrote. They, meaning his fellow pilgrims, had no friends to welcome them, no houses, or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. And these savage barbarians, when they met with them, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. What could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? End quote. Well, this New England contribution to the essential big lie of an empty land, or one which the Indians were not really using, isn't even internally consistent. How can a desolate wilderness, supposedly without houses or fields, be full of wild men? Yet Bradford's work made its way through the centuries into other books and has shaped white America's perception of itself for a dozen generations. Both the mainstream Puritans and the Pilgrims, who were a different sect of Puritans, saw themselves as modern saints migrating from the old world to the new, a belief system that would eventually spawn the Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, in the 1830s. They were the new Israelites, a chosen people on a divine errand to transform a supposed wilderness into a promised land, as commanded by the Lord in the book of Genesis. Get thee out of thy country, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation. As a Puritan town meeting was said to have voted in 1640 after becoming troubled in conscience about taking Indian land. 1. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. 2. The Lord can dispose of the earth to his saints. 3. We are his saints. If America was a second Canaan turned over to the saints by God, it was also occupied by Canaanites, dusky descendants of Ham, with whom racial mixing was forbidden. The Puritan attitude towards American Indians was therefore deeply conflicted from the start. On the one hand, they saw it as their duty to win the heathen to the God of love. On the other, they rejoiced when Jehovah reverted to Old Testament form and smote the heathen with plagues or intervened in battle on the invader's behalf. The oval seal of the Governor and Company of Massachusetts Bay, struck in 1629, has an inscription surrounding a crude image of a naked Indian from whose mouth issues a speech bubble with the words, "Come over and help us." It is perhaps the first product of the American advertising industry, and by no means the least disingenuous. Both cultures became deeply changed through contact, a process that would continue along the rolling frontier for centuries, creating a hybrid society wherever Native and white America traded blows, goods, and ideas. The well-known exchange is of vices, the new Americans taking up tobacco and giving the old Americans liquor in return. Less well known is the degree to which white settlers became Americanized in subtler ways. Of the hundreds of words that passed into English, some, such as the Algonquian caucus, a word we've been hearing a lot recently, express abstractions as well as things. At the time of the Revolution, the native language was still being widely spoken, even by whites, in the whaling area of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And Indians dominated the whale fishery in the early days. Massachusetts Bay used wampum, the indigenous shell currency, as legal tender for decades, and that colony's law forbidding whites from building wigwams instead of English-style houses gives a strikingly fresh picture of what early Boston must have looked like. The greatest Puritan fears, however, lay in the spiritual realm. In 1642, a young man named Thomas Granger was caught having sex with a horse, admitting further pleasures with, quote, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey, end quote. The judges wanted to know whether he had acquired his tastes in Old England or New, fearing the latter because, quote, Satan hath more power in these heathen lands. While relieved to learn that Granger's habits hailed from the mother country, they executed him along with all the 4-footed sinners who could be identified. And my editors did point out that turkeys don't have 4 feet. But I think we've already said a lot about the empty land, but it's worth quoting what Francis Parkman, who was America's great popular historian of the mid-19th century, who built on this myth and solidified it. He said, the Indians melted away not because civilization destroyed them, but because their own ferocity and intractable indolence made it impossible that they should exist in its presence, end quote. In other words, the Indians were not merely unlucky enough to be run over by civilization's advance, but by being both savage and lazy, were actually to blame for their own extermination. While echoes of blame the victim rhetoric would be heard down the years, and especially a century later in Vietnam, with the argument that it was necessary to destroy the village or even the country in order to pacify it. As the modern American historian Patricia Limerick has written, it is no easy matter to distinguish the lessons of the Indian Wars from the lessons of Vietnam. Hollywood has persuaded us that the only real Indian is a buffalo hunter. And how many of us know that Indians were farmers living in towns and even cities? That even the buffalo hunters like the Sioux and the Cheyenne were refugees from the invaded East, former corn farmers obliged to take up buffalo hunting when their farmland was overrun by whites. How many of us know that the biggest building in North America until quite well into the 20th century is a great earthen pyramid with a bigger footprint than the Great Pyramid of Egypt, and that this is only one of more than 120 platforms at the ancient American city of Cahokia near St. Louis. So in some ways, white America's trouble was that the Indians didn't melt away. Very often they did from disease, as I read in those early excerpts, but eventually the populations developed some immunity and were able to recover. And the problem then arose that some native peoples adopted the material culture of the whites and began to recreate themselves as modern nation states. And this was something that Jefferson and other people had encouraged in the early days. The argument was, our settlers can't live next to you because you're savages, but if you become civilized, then it'll be all right. Well, of course, many of these so-called tribes were, in fact, civilized societies, the sort of people who build pyramids and obviously live in the same place for a very long time. But what they did was add the beginnings of white industrial culture and also political culture to their own institutions. And so the Cherokee Nation had built itself a modern capital with a Supreme Court, an assembly, a printing press and they published their own newspaper in Cherokee and English and created themselves as a nation state. And that actually made them more of a threat. And in the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson had to remove the Cherokees and the other groups known as the 5 civilized tribes by forced ethnic cleansing, the first and perhaps the worst example of ethnic cleansing carried out by a democracy. However, what I'm seeking in this book is not a list of misdeeds. Every mighty nation has them. But it's the pattern of those deeds, so that we can understand America and the way it plays on, or is likely to play on the world stage. I think I'm going to move on from the Indian Wars to the Spanish-American War, which was really when America, it was kind of a coming out party for the United States as an imperial power. The United States had been planning the Spanish War long before a good casus belli could be found, a policy similar in several ways to the hunting of Iraq a century later. Spain's Caribbean islands went down like old horses at a bullfight. Few Americans died, and Roosevelt's, this is Theodore Roosevelt, Roosevelt's Rough Riders covered themselves with glory. The Secretary of State called it a splendid little war. Under peace terms denounced by the anti-imperialists as colonial vassalage, the United States made Cuba a protectorate and took the naval base of Guantanamo Bay as its commission. Things would not go so smoothly in the Philippines, which has been called America's first Vietnam. And there was this policy of imperialism was very, very hotly contested at the time. About half the country wanted it, half the country was opposed to it, largely on idealistic grounds. And this anti-imperialist league was an important movement, and it included some unlikely bedfellows, socialists, industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie, although most of the industrialists were on the other side, and the philosopher Henry James's brother, William James, was one of the most vocal critics of this imperialism policy. Well, looking back on these events from the far side of the 20th century, one can see the seeds of future wars being planted as if by a malevolent fate. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Cuba, Guantanamo, all the famous names today, not for the events of the 1890s, but for those of the 1940s, the 1960s, and 2001. The death of the old world empire built by the conquistadors became the birth of a new world empire that would claim the coming century as its own. Well, in the Philippines, America would learn the limits and costs of imperial reach, just as Spain had long before. It was one thing to conquer indigenous Americans and Polynesians who could be counted on to melt away from introduced diseases, quite another to acquire a large subject population that was biologically a part of Asia. Greed had to be dressed up as a sacred duty to bring the savage into civilization, as before. The Philippines are ours forever, Senator Beveridge told Congress in a speech entitled "In Support of an American Empire." And just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee under God of the civilization of the world. One senator declared that letting the Filipinos keep their freedom would be, quote, the highest cruelty. Another said America need not shrink from imperialism because hers would be the imperialism of liberty. Well, whatever his reasons, President McKinley wanted the Philippines just as George W. Bush wanted Iraq. Words written by the American historian Tyler Dennett in 1922 could easily apply to either war. Quote, "The policy was adopted in great ignorance of the actual facts, and in a blissful and exalted assumption that any race ought to regard conquest by the American people as a superlative blessing." End quote. It took 60,000 US troops 2 years to confer that blessing and capture the Filipino leader Aguinaldo. From the scanty reports that leaked out between 1899 and 1901, it is clear that in cruelty and in injustice, the Philippine War reprised the Indian Wars and foretokened Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. William James, Henry's brother, said that McKinley's cant has reached perfect expertness in the art of killing silently. The Anti-Imperialist League did what it could to break that silence by publishing soldiers' letters. One officer wrote home about the town of Caloocan. I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a town that is now a suburb of Manila. Caloocan was supposed to contain, this is what the soldier wrote, 17,000 inhabitants. The 20th Kansan swept through it, and now Caloocan contains not one living native. End quote. Another private confessed that he had, with his own hand, quote, set fire to over 50 houses of Filipinos, end quote. When journalists at last got to the war zone, they confirmed the worst, including use of a torture that is again in the news today as waterboarding, a near-drowning technique that the Americans had condemned the Spaniards for practicing, but then adopted themselves in the Philippines and have again been using in the so-called War on Terror. Our men, reported the Philadelphia Ledger, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners, and captives. Our soldiers have pumped salt water into men to make them talk, end quote. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Secretary of War, which is now called the Secretary of Defense, Elihu Root, was answering the critics with sang-froid. The war in the Philippines has been conducted by the American Army with scrupulous regard for the rules of civilized warfare, with self-restraint, and with humanity never surpassed, end quote. Well, in 2003, Root's modern successor, Donald Rumsfeld, would use that very same word, humanity, to describe his bombing of Iraq. And I have Rumsfeld's words here. The book has extensive notes, and here in the back is a longer quote from Rumsfeld, quoted in the Boston Globe, and I remember seeing it on CNN. The care that goes into it, the humanity that goes into it. Every single target has been analyzed and the weapon has been carefully selected. It is an enormously impressive effort, a humane effort. Thank you, Donald. In a recent opinion poll taken for the CBC, 52% of those interviewed chose the United States as, quote, the country that stands out as a negative force in the world, end quote. The second choice, Iran, came in at 21%. It is likely that a similar poll taken in Europe, Australia, or Latin America would yield similar results. American prestige has never been lower. Yet, whether we like it or not, the United States is such a military and economic power that what it does is everyone's business. All of us, Americans and outsiders, must live with this land of paradox. A democracy hobbled by theocracy and plutocracy. A peace-loving country at war almost constantly for 400 years. A nation both well-meaning and rapacious, welcoming and suspicious, devout and materialistic, friendly and fearful, innocent and corrupt, libertarian and repressive, individualistic and conformist, generous and grasping, imperial and parochial, modern and archaic. We may still hope for progressive American leadership in the world, and there are certainly signs that the great machine of American democracy is still capable of repairing itself. But we can no longer afford the old 20th century habit of depending on American leadership. Repeatedly seduced by atavistic impulses, America has become an unreliable member of the world community. Despite the sorry record of the past 8 years, the elections this November could still go either way. Too many voters, like the first President Bush, don't care what the facts are. Too many opt for the fast food of the national myth instead of the sobering nourishment of history, even history so fresh that its dead are not yet cold. Thank you very much.